everyone. Welcome to this webinar on building the right fence. My name is David Fournier, and I work here at Adventist Risk Management, serve as the Chief Client Care Officer. Thank you for taking the time to join us and think a little bit about child protection today, and that is the focus of our webinar, our conversation today. I don't think we have any housekeeping items to attend to, other than perhaps just the comment that we do look for interaction whenever possible. I know that a webinar is not always the easiest place for digital interaction, but there is a tool in this system called the Q&A box or window, and you can use that to answer or ask questions and have them answered, and we'll try to do that as much as possible. I do have a team member, Elizabeth Camps, who's helping me out with that as well, and Elizabeth may also share with you links to resources that could be are relevant to what we're speaking about, so look for those as well. We are recording the webinar, so we will be happy to share our recording online later on so that you could share it with a friend or review it later if you so choose. All right, we're going to try to keep this one fairly brief. I think it gets into the heart of the matter, so I hope you'll find it very useful. Certainly had some good feedback about this presentation at our risk management conference in Dallas back in September of this year. So wanted to tighten it up just a little bit and also get it recorded so that we could share it with more people who might not have been able to attend there. All right, with that, let's dig in. And again, this is about child protection in our church system, which is a very, very important issue. It's one that we care a great deal about. I have to say that I am encouraged and pleased and very hopeful that while we certainly can't claim complete victory, that no harm will come to any child any further, I think the church has taken the very practical steps, some very significant practical steps at every level to improve the safety for our children. And it's important to acknowledge the successes as well as the challenges. It's easy for us to look at this issue and say, well, that's very frustrating and sad, which it is. But I think it's also very important for us to realize that great things are happening in this space. And my own thanks goes to those of you who are paying attention to this issue and have joined us for this webinar, and the countless volunteers and employees, teachers, pastors who stand up and stand for the right thing and implement the policies and changes and processes that need to happen in order for our kids to be protected when they are participating in any church activity. So just a brief comment here as we get started. This is some information I really like to share when I'm speaking to particularly lay audiences like Pathfinder leaders or Sabbath school teachers, and anybody that we get a chance to speak to at conference training events or whatnot. And just to start off with a reminder that when we're talking about whatever it is that is your sphere of influence, whether you're the elder or the deacon, or you teach a Sabbath school or you lead a Pathfinder club, that you are, you have to look at this group as your flock. This is what you're responsible to care for. And with that comes some pretty grave opportunities, responsibilities. And it's important to recognize that this is a leadership role, and with that, when parents sign their kids up for Pathfinders, they have all the right things in mind, right? They're looking for, a great experience where their child will be exposed to positive influences and positive activities, ideas. They're going to be taught good things that they want their kids to understand and know. They want that supplemental help, that they're leading their children, and they're looking for that help from the church to do that as well. What they're not thinking is that when they give their child into a church organization's care, custody, and control, they're not expecting that something dreadful will happen there. So when we accept that child into our control, our care, custody, and control, we do assume a duty, right? So, and it is a duty to return that child, as they say, in the same condition that it was received or delivered. So, and then the larger issue that I don't know that many fully grasp in our church, and it's key to how our church is organized, is this idea that you really represent something larger than yourself. And I think sometimes we grasp that concept in regards to more of the spiritual part of that idea, which is great, and that's important as well. It's probably the most important part, where yes, we represent something larger than ourselves, in that we represent God, right? We represent Christianity. We represent these ideas to children, right? So when one of our leaders, one of us, one of our volunteers, or whomever it may be, sort of violates that trust, a child will often associate that violation with authority in general, or the greatest authority, which is God. So I want to make this idea just a little bit more down to earth, though, because it has more repercussions than that larger spiritual concept. It has also some very practical application in that the way that our church is structured. Let's just pick on Pathfinders for no particular reason. A Pathfinder leader does not simply represent their club, right? They don't just represent their local church as the leader of that club either. Because if you think from a legal standpoint, the way our church is organized, if a lawsuit comes against the organization because of the actions of that leader, the choices that they may have made, whether it was to do something wrong, or much more likely to have not done all that was expected to provide protection for the child, whether it's in planning, supervision, accommodation, or transportation issues, and harm came to that child because of what was not done, which organization is going to receive the lawsuit? It's not that individual. It's going to go to the lowest legal entity recognized within our Seventh-day Adventist church structure, and that's the conference. Well, even at our smallest conferences are fairly large organizations from an asset standpoint. They may not be always cash rich, but they do own significant amounts of property and are a significantly large organization. So lawsuits that come against that organization have to be defended, but it's defending a large organization. And that's an important thing for us to understand. This is not like some of our sister church communities. Like let's pick on the Baptists for a second. They're a much differently organized denomination, right? It's denominational, congregational. So you have a Baptist church, and it is simply a group of Baptists who have decided to form a church, and they pay the pastor themselves. That pastor often, unless it's a large church, they're often working another job besides. And if they are sued, their insurance policy pays what it can, and then, often if the judgment so demands, they may have to declare bankruptcy in order to, liquidate their assets and try to meet the demand. But how do you do that when your organization is as large as a conference, right? So a demand comes against a conference. Well, now it's the insurance assets of the entire Seventh-day Adventist Church that have to come to bear. And let's say that those were not part of the equation. It's the entire assets of the whole conference. So you see that it's a little bit of a different scenario. And honestly, this organization has been one of our incredible strategic advantages. And I really do believe that. I think the Seventh-day Adventist Church has a particular special message for end times. I believe I've been very blessed by God, and in no small part to the way that we've been directed to be organized, because we are very organized, and it allows us to have pastors that in places that cannot afford to have pastors, or Bible workers, or teachers. We work together, and we are mission focused, and we look beyond ourselves. This is why we've been able to explode in missions around the world and go to so many countries and have our materials in so many languages. But with that comes the responsibility to behave in a way and follow the rules that we set up for ourselves, because of the nature of the type of organization that we are. So I hope that's a helpful insight for you. But it's something that I wish our church members, many of them, I don't see the opportunity in that, and the value that is brought by being organized and coordinated together in that process, because there is a great deal of value there. Okay, so that is the responsibility that comes with, taking on some of these roles, right? Whether you're leading a Sabbath school or a Pathfinder club or whatever it is, you're not just representing a very small operation, you're representing something quite a bit larger. And so you have a responsibility to operate as expected in that capacity. And I think that's a reasonable expectation. And I think that most of our conferences have very great policies. Certainly the policy that I get to read at more of the North American Division and GC, the church manual, there's some very good guidance in each of these documents, and important that we follow it. And we're going to look at a few of those ideas today in particular. Just quickly going to overview sort of the cost of abuse. I think I'm preaching to the choir here. Hopefully I'm not preaching. Speaking to the choir. These comments are meant to help us just sort of grasp what we're up against. And that is that, the church has spent roughly $30 million on child, mostly sex abuse over the last 20 years. If we look at I did an analysis over the last 10 years recently, and that's being updated as we speak. But within a year, my analysis of the last 10 years was about 168 cases, some of which were still open and closed. So, and some were closed. So the final numbers will change a little bit on that, but that's generally what we're looking at there. And some of the cases do range in severity. Obviously, none of them are things that you want to have happen, but there is certainly a range in severity that can take place there. We look for trends, right? Who are the perpetrators in these cases? Are they pastors? Well, yeah, there are pastors represented, teachers, Pathfinder leaders, any type of volunteer. There's plenty where it's a deacon. We've had people who operate the AV equipment abusing children. Really just anybody that's there may have this kind of propensity and thing that they're going to do or look to do. So we need to look for that. We need to be very, very careful that we don't just create a solution for, shall we say, the Sabbath school leader. Well, protecting our children from the Sabbath school leader is good. They need to certainly be included in that, but that's not the only risk that we face as a church. In fact, the Sabbath school leader may be in one of the more controlled scenarios. But what about some of these places like an AV booth that's, only got one person in it and they're largely unsupervised? Are we letting our kids sort of wander about and get into places like that? Is somebody able to bring a child in there and no one's going to know who's in there? Is that a pretty, private, shielded place where no one can observe what's taking place there? You see the last note bullet on the slide here. It says 2 cases of strangers trying to abduct or molest children. And this is going to get to the heart of what we're here to talk about today. So we look at all of the cases over 10 years. There's been 168 cases. Of course, that number goes up considerably if you go over the last 20 years. Two cases that I could find where it was really that stranger danger type of concept. So that's a pretty small percentage overall of that type of problem. So it's important for us to understand that problem and to address it and to protect our children from that scenario. But in many cases, our minds, and I don't mean specifically just us in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but our minds in general, we tend to want to solve that problem. That's the one we're geared for, right? We're built for that. It's that there's the odd person who is scary and bad, sort of, that outside, scary bad person. That's what we want to protect against. But what this also means is if there's only 2 cases of strangers trying to abduct or molest children, that means that there are, hundreds more where it wasn't a stranger. And that's really what we need to be wrapping our minds around, is how do we protect against people who are not strangers, who are already in our midst, who are often family members of the victim or part of our church family. They are already inside. And so we're going to think through that a little bit more. Let's look at some of our plan. The church has, and this is, I mentioned this earlier, the church has created a lot of policies that I find to be very practical. I am actually very excited about what the church has done. I'm proud of our stance. If you look at some of the other denominations' approach to this issue, they have clearly suffered for their late and poor response. I'm not going to say that we have not had our own faults and problems, but I do believe the Seventh-day Adventist Church has made good steps, and I'm not going to say that we haven't, because we certainly have. Now, do we always follow all of our own guidance? Have we fully implemented those ideas? Well, that's an area that takes continual work. But if we look at NAD church policy, there's a number of places where child protection policies can be found. The first area is in a section called FB 20, and you should be fairly familiar with these ideas. The idea of a 6-month rule, reference checks, criminal background checks, training, prompt reporting, and discipline. And then in FB 25, this is more of the code of conduct, I believe, area. The 2-adult rule, that we're not going to allow our volunteers to, be alone with children where their reputation is really just sort of on the line. Appropriate touch, that we will, learn what that is and ensure that that is what is being used, and that's how we're expected to behave. Appropriate child discipline, that we're not getting into areas that could get us into more trouble than it solves. Door vision panels, and then the training and reporting is also referenced there. So these are some of the policy things that we've done as a church, and I think these are all good elements. I don't believe in a magic bullet for protecting our children. I do believe it's a multi aspect approach that's needed in order to do this. So let's go through 3 steps for success with child protection. The first one, and I think this is true of every aspect of risk management. No matter what you're talking about, it's important, it's critical. It will only succeed at all if leadership is on board. It has to be a priority at the top, and not just a priority at the top for others people below you or below them to do, but it needs to be modeled at the top that, no, this is what we are going to do, this is what I am doing, and I expect those around me to be held accountable. I will hold you accountable to do what we have said to do. So whether it's policies that are developed at your conference or above organizations above that we're holding ourselves accountable to those policies and processes that we've decided to pursue. Insist on implementation of training and screening. Insist on the implementation of policies and guidelines. And I reference that because I just had the opportunity to sort of take a look at a report from verified volunteers of how many screenings and trainings have been done since they've been implemented as the recommended organization for that across the NAD for the background screening and training. And overall, and they've been in place just about 2 years, I guess, with some of that time being early implementation. So maybe 2.5 for some, or 1.5 for some organizations. There have been about 49,000, just about 50,000 people screened through that system in that amount of time. I think that's a good start, and I keep in mind too that some people had just been screened just prior through the previous vendor who provided that service, and we're on that 3-year renewal process where people need to be background screened every 3 years for our volunteers. So I guess I'm tentatively or tepidly pleased with those numbers. I do suspect that is low given the amount of people in any type of leadership role at our churches across the entire North American division. I think we have, 1.2 or 3 million members, and certainly there's probably a percentage of those that are not active members, and then not every active member is serving in any role. So we have to reduce those numbers just a little bit just to get to who should be screened, but I suspect it's quite a bit more than 50,000. So quite a bit of work to do there. I have to, again, throw a big thank you to several key people, and I know of at least one of you that's on this webinar right now who have really taken the bull by the horns and are very intentional about implementing that, pursuing that background screening and training process at your conference. And it's not always easy work because not everyone wants to do that. There are a lot of sensitivities today about any use of information, but I really do appreciate the hard work that you do to make that a success. So I want to share with you an analogy. I hope you'll forgive me if this seems a little bit well, you'll see. Here we go. I go back to this concept, this analogy from time to time, and that is, if we are looking to protect our kids, and we've let's use the concept of a chicken coop as the analogy. You see our chickens in here, and there's a nice wall around them, and we're very concerned about foxes. Foxes are dangerous, strange, scary creatures that want to eat chickens. And we have gone to considerable lengths to, dig in our fencing deep into the earth so that they can't dig underneath, and high enough that they couldn't jump over. I'm not sure the fence in this picture is high enough. And we've worked really, really, really hard to keep those foxes out of there. But But I guess the question that I have is, what if we don't have a fox problem? What if we have an eagle problem? And I think that's exactly where we are. We have um, a lot of our great processes that we are most focused on, and they are important, and I'm not advocating that we stop or remove those. But some of them are more focused on preventing the known abuser outside of our ranks, the strange and person off the street, the that known offender kind of idea. But what about what we really have, which is an eagle, or or whatever the analogy needs to be, that can actually come in right through the open roof, right? That is already inside and has complete access to our kids, or can have that access. So in our experience, the church really gets in trouble not so much for what we do. We don't have a church organization that is in any way malicious or looking to do anyone harm. We don't plan events thinking, well, we'll probably lose some kids here, or there's no malicious intent of any kind. So where do we get into trouble? With the $30 million in losses over the last 20 years. We get in trouble for the things that we haven't done, that we didn't provide sufficient supervision, or we didn't do our checks. We didn't find out. And one of the ones that I hear probably more often from people who have either a family member who was molested, or they themselves, and I do speak to these people fairly regularly. They'll often find me and want to share their story, and I want to hear their stories. But what I often hear, their greatest concern is, well, this person was known. They were known to have had problems at one church, and they got transferred to a different place to cause more problems again. So what really can we do about that? And I think it goes right back to understanding what is our problem, how do we build the right fence for the problem we have. So, okay, we've talked a little bit already about understanding the problem we have. It's the people already inside that are our greatest risk. We need to have, effective policies. I think for the most part we do have very effective policies. I'm sure some conferences could brush up some elements. But I've bolded 3 of these concepts as maybe things we could emphasize or think through, clarify with our leaders across our churches and schools. And that is the 6-month rule. I've personally seen this one ignored repeatedly. Some family moves to a new church, and they're a lovely family, and hey, we used to work at we volunteered with kids at our last church. We have kids, we used to lead the Pathfinder Club, and we're great at it, and we're happy to help. We're here to serve. Fantastic. And you just happen to really desperately need a leader at your church. All of a sudden, that 6-month rule, where does that go? It's out the window. But you need the time to get to know these people. You need to find out, are they careful about following all of these policies? Are they extra careful about making sure that there's no possibility of accusation, not just of themselves, but those around them? Are they very careful about the communication, about appropriate touch, about just making sure that everything is above board and that they're going to stand for the right things? Because you shouldn't just be evaluating them to not be a scary person, an offender. You should be evaluating them, are they someone who can lead and uphold, even when it's unpleasant, the rules and policies that we have here at our organization? The second bolded item here is effective reference checking. This one is critical. We're going to look at this one just a little bit more because I honestly think this may be ultimately one of our best defenses against those individuals who just sort of move from church to church whenever things get a little bit uncomfortable. When people start to think, oh, I'm starting to wonder about this guy a little bit, and they move to a different church and they start over again. Effective reference checking. Because in so many cases, when it comes to these sexual molestation abuse cases, it is very difficult to prosecute these cases effectively. I've heard of so many cases where the police simply give up. I have no facts to pursue this case. There's nothing. There's not a good witness. There's not good facts. I can't get it prosecuted. So depending solely on the fact that somebody gets a criminal record will often fall far short of the reality of what somebody may have actually been doing, because they may not have that criminal record. I also want to emphasize the 2 adult rule. This is, again, you want your volunteers, your new people, you want them to want this, because it's a defense not just of the kids but of themselves. You want people who are looking to enforce and include this into their program, not people who are happy to marginalize this concept. Okay? I think that is clear. Clear reporting structure and expectations. This is one we'll work on a bit more this year. Helping our people understand when I do see something wrong, when I am aware of something, there's the reporting to the authorities component. I think people are starting to really understand that part. I think obviously we are going to have more work to do in that area, but it is probably a clearer concept of, if I saw something that was abuse, or what I believe there may be abuse taking place, I report that to the authorities, they investigate, they figure it out. Okay, but what about internally? Who do I tell internally? Does it stop at my pastor? Does it stop at the principal? What should I know, or what am I going to know, if anything, about the process after I pass it on to the internal people in the church that need to know what's happening? Is it clear what the expectation is in your conference, in your church or school, of what that report, what's going to happen with that report, and who's going to carry the ball to make sure that the right things are done? This is another concern I hear from those who have actually experienced abuse, is they often just seemed like they thought nothing happened, when in fact perhaps many things had happened, but they simply didn't know what was happening. And obviously there is a need for discretion in many cases. However, clarity around the process is very, very important, and it makes sure that it does happen and work correctly. So let's look at the reference checking just a little bit more. Really important for an effective reference checking process. I know for many conferences, they actually operate the reference checking at the conference level, and I think that is very appropriate and probably the best way to do this whenever possible. I know it's kind of nice to actually have that third-party reference checking perspective, and I know the conference isn't a third party here, but it's a nice way. Often the conference office is hours away or not immediately close by, and it's nice to have somebody who's just doing that, who may not be ultimately intimately familiar with the small faith community that's taking place, that you're part of. But that sometimes that reference checking may be taking place at a local church or school, and for those, I think it's really important for them to have a plan and what the expectations of how to perform that function are. Be organized and have a very good list of questions. Don't start from from scratch every time. You know, have a plan, and here's what is a good list of questions to ask. Asking open-ended questions, definitely more informative. Yes, no really doesn't get us very far, but explaining how somebody felt about something and what they saw, what they experienced is much, much more informative. Be relevant to the responsibilities at stake. You know, you want to talk to people about things that actually matter. We're going to look at some of the questions here in just a moment as well. I think I've actually been missing some of the conversation that's going on in the chat area. I will catch up with that. Oh no, okay, I am caught up. That was the one question. Okay, well, we're going to look at questions next, on the next slide. Listen for tone of voice and listen for hesitation. You're really, people may not tell you the information that you need to hear, but sometimes how they say what they say will go a long way. And so you kind of need to know what you're looking for. That hesitation can speak volumes, especially if you've asked the right kinds of questions. So let's look at those now. I can get my slide to advance. Here we are. So you're going to want your basics, right? So if you're asking about somebody who served as a Pathfinder leader at a previous church, okay, so when did they serve? What were the dates? What roles did they have? You know, make sure that the answers that you're getting are the same as the answers that the individual gave, the volunteer gave. How do you know this person and for how long? Some references may have, you know, be an acquaintance of theirs who it was a very positive relationship, but it may not actually be meaningful. It just may be a person who's happy to say a positive word. So it's important to kind of measure how valuable is this perspective. How did the relationship end? You know, why did the person leave? What happened there? Do you know if this person has financial difficulties or a history of drug or alcohol abuse? May be a good question to be asking in many cases. I know certainly if somebody was going to be driving my Pathfinder club, I would want to know certainly about their history of drug or alcohol abuse. Would you trust this person to drive your children specifically, not just children in general, but your children? Often that helps people dive a little deeper into their own emotional response to the question. Here's probably what I think may be one of the better questions to ask, and there may be some nuanced, you know, ways of doing this, but at its core, it comes down to this. Is there any reason I should be uncomfortable allowing this person to supervise children? And that question is phrased very, very carefully. Is there any reason I should be uncomfortable allowing this person to supervise children? Those are some key words in there. And then you're listening for a tone of voice, you're listening for a hesitation. You know, somebody thinking about their answer is fine, I'm sure, but it should be fairly quick and a happy yes, or not yes. There should be, you know, it should be an affirmative that there should be no reason that they'd be uncomfortable. Wow, I'm spinning around my double negatives. Is there anything else I should know? That's a pretty open-ended question, and often that can be very, very informative to this discussion as well. If you're looking for more of these sample questions, Elizabeth has a resource we developed for, I think it was late this summer, that really gets into reference checking, and Elizabeth has just shared it there as a link in the chat feature. And it's checking references. There's some resources there that you can review, sample questions, how to go about asking the questions. I would encourage investing significant time and focus and energy into developing our skills in this area specifically. And then really the next area is one we've been preaching for years, and an area that is no surprise, but continues to be the sort of that concept, and its supervision that the church gets hung up on more than many other areas. I see there's a question. Let me read that really quick, and we'll see if we can answer that now. Okay, so here's the question. Is there any advice when marking someone as ineligible based on references? Well, certainly the advice is, that, so that's when somebody's gone through their okay, so you're talking about marking them ineligible based on the background screen, but you have also done reference checks. So the background screen came clear, and now based on the reference checking, you're marking them as ineligible. So it's two different processes, but at the end of the day, you're combining them there at the conference level. Okay. Well, I think it's certainly the right thing to do. I don't have a lot of advice to say, other than the same advice that you're going to be needing whenever somebody is marked as ineligible. The local church is only going to know that the person's ineligible, and it's a fairly short conversation for them at that end, because they don't really know anything. At times, I suppose, and many of you may actually have more experience on this than certainly I would, a volunteer may actually reach up to the conference to find out why they might have been marked as ineligible. But I would keep it fairly brief. I don't think there's a need to let everyone in behind the scenes on all of that. It is a choice that your organization has to either grant somebody the opportunity to serve in that way or not. And we often get a little fuzzy about that concept, that we are an organization that can make choices about who participates, who even attends. And certainly if it goes down that road and there's any persistence or resistance, it's probably a good idea to make the conference attorney aware, and receive some guidance at that point about how to navigate it further. But keeping your comments certainly brief at the outset is good advice. The second part of the question is there any liability to our conference when a background check comes out clear? I think maybe the question is better phrased. Does a clear background check remove any liability? No. When it comes to liability, the world is nuanced and gray, and there are so many factors that can play in, right? So it's not. No, I think I've lost my question. It's not in front of me anymore. Oh, there it is. Okay, my apologies. I'm using the tool here as best I can. So I don't think you get to remove liability from the conference or your organization just because a background check came out clear. All that having the background check come back clear does is it says, well, of all the things that we need to do to protect our children, that is one of those things that we did, which we were expected to do, which a reasonable organization would do, and the information that we received from it is that we were clear. Okay? And so we operated based on that information that was available to us. And that will be sort of your defense in court if, in fact, this person then proceeds to abuse someone. Well, what did you folks do to protect the children in this case? Well, we did reference checks, we did background checks, came back clear. We have the 2-adult rule, which we followed. We did these things. We've done everything we possibly could have done. And it certainly helps the case. That doesn't mean that it solves your problems entirely, because at the end of the day, abuse may have taken place anyway, but it may minimize the responsibility of the conference in that type of a scenario. I hope that answers the question. Um, Unfortunately, with these cases, it just becomes a whole lot of nuanced data points that the attorneys get to work through, given the law of the local jurisdiction, which can vary from place to place. Okay, here's another good question too. When a larger offense has taken place, we have informed the pastor, of the incident. As a conference, are we able to disclose this information to the pastor? Uh, yes, yes, you are. In fact, I don't think there are any rules that you are prevented from disclosing this information further. I think it's, at some point it becomes how helpful is disclosing this information, and how potentially harmful is disclosing this information further. Um, I know of one church where the pastor and the head elder were aware of a sex offender who wanted to continue to attend that church, and so they made an agreement with that person as far as that sex offender agreement, where it was defined where that person would be, where they could sit, where they could go to the bathroom, when they could be there, who would be kind of supervising them, and I guess it was the pastor and the head elder who took on that responsibility. Well, ultimately, that pastor was transferred elsewhere, and the head elder, left or passed away. And that little church had no idea that there was a sex offender in their midst all of that while, who was operating under the idea that he had an agreement to be there, but an agreement with people who were no longer there. So sometimes I think we're a little bit too careful about hiding all of this kind of information. On the other hand, if you get too public with it, it creates more noise than is certainly helpful. You can get accusations of defamation and that kind of thing as well. But again, which one do you want to defend? Do you want to defend potential defamation, which, there's probably some defense against that, actually, if we're reasonably expected to defend our children, or do you want to have another, sex abuse case to deal with? I'm going to move to another question. When volunteers refuse to take the background check due to their legal status, what action should we take? Oh, this is one of the most challenging scenarios to get into. And if I understand the question correctly, it is dealing with somebody is not legally here in this country, and so they don't want to provide their information anywhere because they're fearful that the government might, be able to detect them and their illegal status, because they've shared some sort of information with the background screening organization. I've actually, there is no connection between the background screening at all and the government. There just isn't one. How do you reassure people of that? I know Verified Volunteers has actually produced a letter. I saw it early this morning that they've written that explains exactly that concept. I'm going to see if we can have that translated into Spanish, which is, the language where it may be most useful for the most people. I think the other piece that people have to understand is, you don't actually have to enter your Social Security. But I think just helping people understand that this is the expectation in this country, and the legal environment in this country is such that if you're going to be, part of the church and operating as a volunteer in the church here in this country, this is the expectation we have to follow. And that's an adjustment for some people, and it's going to be difficult, and you're going to have people who don't cooperate. And it's really, really necessary to continue to educate and share and reassure as best we can. The next follow-up question to that is the idea of, can we access the letter from verified volunteers on the ARM website? No, it's not our letter, and we're not trying to share it. But if you have contact with verified volunteers, I'm sure they're happy to share it with you. So let's keep moving on to sort of our last major section. That is step 3, effective supervision. Minimum of 2 adults supervising children and youth at all times. This is really key. We've talked about that already. The vision panels, it's really just about creating an environment where people can't get into trouble, because the whole scenario is designed for openness and for clarity. Transparency, it really is the key concept here. I also really get very nervous when there are parts of our facility that may not be used, but they're accessible, right? So you have like a maintenance room, you have the baptistry area, or can kids get in there? Can they get back there? I mean, I'm concerned about sexual abuse. I'm also concerned about a kid drowning in a baptismal tank because they could get in there when unobserved. Look for good exterior lighting for nighttime outdoor activities, and whenever possible, provide roaming adult supervision. Just monitor what's going on in our facilities. Ensure that our volunteers have gone through training and that our volunteers understand behavioral expectations. Training of knowing what red flags to look for, and that I think we get good information on that in the verified volunteers training, and I've seen other training that has been offered in different places as well. The previous vendor, good training, it all made sense. It was certainly helpful to me. So knowing what you're looking for, both in a kid who may be being abused or a potential offender. What does that look like? How do those people behave? And ARM also has a number of other resources. I see Elizabeth has posted that there in the chat feature, and that is, on our website under the, I think it's, if you go to risk management concepts there, and you drop down to the church section, there's a whole child protection section. You can get those resources there. If you go there, you can find the resource also on reference checks, on a volunteer information form, those kinds of things that will really help you if you don't have those kinds of things developed by your organization already. Just make it easy to onboard your volunteers with good information. I want to close with this concept. The church really does well when it acts like the church, and this has never been more true in the idea of child protection. I believe that we can create an environment for our kids that really responds to the type of risks we have. Whether that is those strangers outside of our gates who are looking to prey on our kids, or those people who are internal already, which seems to be where many of our risks take place. And so many of the abuse cases today are really taking place between our own young people. Child-on-child abuse. We really need to watch, supervise our children effectively. And I want to close with just saying thank you. Thank you so much for all the work that you do as you lead in your organizations, whether that's at a conference. I see several conference folks here whose names I recognize. I appreciate you. I know what you do is not always appreciated, because you are bringing a standard of performance. You're bringing a concept which may mean more work for someone. It may be more difficult. They may have a struggle putting all the resources together in order to do this to the expectations that you're defining. But that is what will protect our children. That is what will make the difference at the end of the day. And I do believe we can make a difference. So thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to spend with me. And I hope this has been useful, helpful for you. really, really appreciate you folks, and I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, happy holidays over the next couple weeks. I hope it's restful, and we get back into the new year invigorated and make a difference for our church and for all of the communities that our churches are seeking to reach with the gospel. Thank you so much. Bye.